It's coming.
Here's one.
Oh, here we go. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you for being here today. The panel is called Riding the Wave. It's probably an overused analogy, but in the space industry, as in other industries that take venture dollars, there are highs and there are lows. And we were just talking about this backstage. My first question is indeed about SPACs. So before we look to the future, I just wanted to take a moment and sort of talk about the past and the present of the space industry. Jordan, this one is for you. Do you think the industry has recovered, whether that's reputationally or the amount of dollars invested from that period of the sort of boom and bust of the SPACs?
I think it's hard to say yet if it has recovered, because it takes time to see, not only how those companies do, but if that kind of exit process is repeatable. And the SPAC wave, a little bit of feedback. And the SPAC wave was, I think, a one-time phenomena, and those lessons are learned where, the investors that did go through those, some made money, some didn't, some were spectacular exits, some were catastrophic. And, but the current market doesn't support that. And so I do think as far as routes to exits is a big question that's coming up in the current wave of startups, whether those are growth companies or those are day one companies, is that there was that huge wave again that we saw, but that's not going to happen. And it's a question, does that lead towards acquisitions? Does that lead to a healthy IPO market? What is the timeline for that happening? And who is going to be that acquirer? So not clear yet.
I mean, on net, it seems like, in retrospect, it's something that is ultimately going to be healthy for the industry. Lewis, do you agree?
Absolutely. I think people recognize now that you can't take space companies public prematurely. I remember the days of watching Astra share price while they were doing their first launches, which I think just goes to show that I don't think there'll be very much of that in future. But there's a lot more questions to Jordan's point around. Oh. Sorry.
Keep going. Just
okay.
keep going.
Sure. So there are going to be a lot more questions around what the ultimate exit looks like for space. And I think there's a portion of investors or a segment of investors that have shied away from space investing because there isn't that route to exit. The acquisitions that have been around last few quarters haven't necessarily been desirable outcomes, and we haven't necessarily seen a pathway to a space company going public properly and winning out on that. So hopefully that shake-up means people start thinking about it, and there'll be some good opportunities in future.
In terms of these companies going public prematurely, I mean, and to your point, this is frontier tech, and it was almost like clockwork. There would be like a failed launch, and you could go check the stock price, and it would tank. And there would be maybe like a, DoD contract announcement, and the stock price would go up. This was something else we were saying backstage, but is this like just the nature of frontier tech going public, or is this like the Wall Street betsification of the industry?
Shall I comment first?
Yeah,
I'd say the latter, to be honest. I don't think there are very well-educated retail investors that are actively investing in the public space startups, particularly the ones that SPAC'd. And so I think you're seeing trying to take a traditional route of venture investing almost in the public markets and looking at it from a milestone-based perspective, but rather than the fundamentals from a public company perspective, which is reviewing financials and creating shareholder value. And that's difficult to dissociate.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing that has shifted is the fact that I'm actually sitting on stage with you all. Mm-hmm. So I don't have a background in space. I'm not a rocket scientist. I did work on the film WALL-E, which I think counts. Right? I get some credit for that. I say that tongue-in-cheek. Obviously, I do not have the accolades and background from an education standpoint that you all do. But I think that there is a very happy medium that we are coming to now. It's not a happy medium, it's an evolution. We are finally to the place where there are generalist investors. If you look across the 776 portfolio, I have several companies under management, only 3 in space, but that is growing. And I think that the fact that you have more people that are now interested, more people that are understanding what it is and what this opportunity is a very, very different time. Like I think we've graduated to a new place where, for decades, people have been working deeply and desperately on this advancement in technology, the advancement in funding and getting attention. So you're seeing NASA giving grants, yes, but they're very risk averse. And so what you're seeing now are people who are very, into risk, very risk heavy, helping to push things forward, but that takes time. And so, if you look back 20 years ago, everyone said, you don't want early stage investors in space tech. Well, why is that? Well, it's super capital intensive, it's slow as a turtle, and it's very heavily regulated, right? But when you think about capital intensive and it being very slow, they're saying, hey, this is a 30-year bet. Your funds are made to return capital in 10 years. Well, guess what? You do the math 20 years ago. I've got 10 years to start. And so when you see folks like me that don't have a background in rocket science showing up and having really keen interest in understanding why and how space is going to actually help us evolve and where we are and how that fits into your fund math and model, it's a very, very smart place to be. And so I don't think we're at the retail place, and we can all have amnesia about the SPAC era, but I think that this is a new chapter and a new evolution of where we are.
Yeah, Caitlin, I wanted to ask you, as Louis just said, the past few years maybe have made some investors shy away from space, but you're saying, no, we're a generalist fund, we're investing in space, and as you just said, you expect that to grow. So I'm curious, coming from outside of the industry, you're a generalist, what does that give your perspective that you think maybe the people that have just been entrenched in the industry maybe are missing?
I don't know that they're necessarily missing something. I think that it's a growing audience, and I think it's growing support. I found space not because I necessarily fancied myself a deep tech investor per se, but it genuinely, I actually found it through climate tech. And so climate tech is something I have been investing in for a very, very long time. And what I was recognizing, this is a funny thing, I don't know if you all have experienced this, but climate tech folk don't much like space folk. If you consider plan A and plan B, plan A is un-F the planet, to be PG, and plan B is go to Mars, right? And the reality is that what is being built in space is everything in between. It's not so black and white. And so, like I said, I found space through climate, and the first company we invested in is Stoke Space, in the business of reusable rockets. And when I was talking with that CEO, Andy, he pointed out a number of things that were very compelling about where this industry was moving. And so for me, when I'm looking at the very audacious founders that are living in that space of you take the Venn diagram of climate tech and space tech, and those people building in the middle, those people are fascinating to me. And so I just became more and more involved and entrenched in what they were doing and just being deeply curious about it. And what I discovered is there is so much to be had from resourcing and harvesting from space to come back and help planet Earth be plan A and have that be a sustainable, thriving thing, to the, hey, how can we expand our reach into the universe? And I think that these two have been in this business for much longer than I have, but it is deeply compelling, and I'm surprised that we aren't seeing more and more VCs showing up in the way that we are.
We've talked a little bit about seed deals already and early stage. Seraphim puts out a quarterly report, and the most recent report found that for every quarter of this year, I do read the reports.
I don't.
You guys send them to me, so I do read them. But it found that seed deals dominated every quarter of this year, and the most recent report said something like this is actually a flip from a few years ago when it was mostly later stage rounds, especially larger rounds from SpaceX and other sort of mature companies. But where does this put the industry in, say, 18 months? All of these seed deals.
Yeah, hopefully we're seeing a lot more capital come in at the later stages in time as well. Ultimately, space is extremely thematic. With the interest rates where they're at, you're seeing later stage capital actually come earlier. And so we're seeing a lot of Series B or Series A funds even come into the early stages, buy a modest stake in the business, learn about the business, learn about space, and then double down at the latter stages. So that's where we see generalists get a little bit more involved.
At the later stages.
Yeah, yeah. And then in time, expecting with interest rate cuts, and there are a few really good initiatives like Office of Strategic Capital and NATO Innovation Fund in Europe that are funding other funds to do the later stage capital side of things. So OSC's investing quite heavily into Series B plus funds, likewise with NATO, and so that's where I see the continuing, and hopefully, yeah, better funded companies at the latter stages too.
Jordan, are you noticing this, the sort of relative dearth of later stage deals in your own business embedded?
Yeah, I think that there's lots of opportunity that wasn't necessarily being looked at before because of the rapid launch costs drop. And so if you look at the seed stage deals today, those are not in launch companies where 3-4 years ago it was predominantly launch and launch activity. So that's something that's coming out as, I'd say, a completely separate wave, distinct wave of companies where the opportunities as those launch costs drop are certain companies, certain sectors that did not make any sense economically or were not visible, to people looking at the economics of them, 3-4 years ago even. So I think we'll see that wave continue to grow, and the launch wave is kind of hitting its crest and transitioning into that kind of application wave.
It seems like at this point with launch, I occasionally get pitched launch startups, people that want me to write about their startups. I'm sure you guys get decks all the time from launch companies. Is there still opportunity there? And this can go to whomever.
Jordan's best qualified, so.
No, I think there's definitely opportunity there, but I think the industry has shown that it's very hard to build a launch company. Then that SpaceX is in, by far, like no doubt, a leading position there. And if you look back, 4 years ago, it was like, 100 startups, them all getting capital, them all having waves, and then the last couple of years, I don't think, have satisfied the expectations of a second leader in the industry. And so that's in some ways showing the difficulty, in some ways showing there's still opportunity then, but it's not nearly as clear how that's going to shake out. But at the very least, it's shown that there is low-cost launch as an option, with SpaceX and Starship continuing to thrive. And so I think we can continue to see that transition towards post-launch, but the launch industry itself is hard to enter despite that opportunity kind of resurging for a new entrant appearing.
Yeah, I mean, I think even, I think about a company like Blue Origin doing many wonderful things, but even with their billionaire backer, they're still needing, spending a lot of time trying to get New Glenn off the ground, and they have Bezos, funding them, and so you can really see, I think, through that use case that it is just an incredibly tough challenge. So I do want to talk about valuations. It seems like also after this, sort of SPAC boom, valuations were sort of out of whack as well. And do you think those have started to adjust and normalize, Lewis?
Yes, I'd say it was post-SPAC boom because I wouldn't say it's correlation rather than causation, just because it was more of a function of the interest rates, and so the interest rates came down, availability of capital dried up a little bit more, and so instant reaction was to normalize valuations in the opposite direction, and that's what made growth businesses raise more modest bridge rounds from internal investors just to hit those milestones to raise at a bit more of a reasonable valuation, and then early stage opportunities. Fewer people willing to invest in startups, so that was the instant reaction. I'd say now it's normalized a little bit more. Again, we're seeing new entrants in terms of investors and funders, and I think because of that, valuations are a little bit more rich again. So it's swayed back and forth.
Caitlin, when do you think we're going to see private investment in space exceed government investment in space? When is that going to finally shift?
That is a great question, and I wish I had a crystal ball for it. My gut instinct, though, says it's actually sooner than we think. It was really interesting. Last week I was at the New York Stock Exchange. Kevin there at the New York Stock Exchange actually hosted the Space Summit. And I learned a phenomenal amount from the guests that were there. And afterwards I was sitting in the audience looking up at the stage, and I recognized that sitting next to the American flag was the Space Force flag. And it was just as normal could be. And as a citizen, I was just like, holy moly. And the gravity of what that means was pretty profound. I have two little ones. I have a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old. And to think that the Space Force flag will be they will just only know that to be a real thing that exists, right? When I think back generationally, my grandfather and grandmother talking about the space race, and my father and his siblings, being glued to the television set, watching every moment. And, my boys, their generation, they want to be Mr. Beast. They want to be influencers. They don't want to be astronauts, right? And for me, that's a problem. Yeah. And so what I'm really excited about is this new chapter that we're turning into making space exciting and fun, the way that it was once, where it's not just something that is interesting. And Rob Meyerson, one of our CEOs at Interloon, a space tech company, he says it's no longer science fiction, it's science fact. And that is what is going to be very, very compelling. And so, like I said, the fact that generalist investors are showing up to the table in really meaningful ways, even at the growth stage, I think is a pretty clear indicator that things are about to shift. So, I don't know. Crystal ball, I think it's going to be sooner rather than later. I think we're coming to a tipping point.
Okay. I mean, I think one of the big realities of the space industry is just the degree to which the overlap with defense, but also the way that there are these amazing tailwinds from Artemis that are very exciting, but they are subject to political realities, to threats to the budget, et cetera. Do you worry about that as a risk in terms of the country could decide to cut Artemis's budget and clips and.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as an early stage investor, risk is our business. And so there's a number of things that come into play, and you want to be mindful of something that is, big. That would be big if that funding were to be pulled back. But that doesn't mean death. And so I think that the more education we can have around that, and again, the more the private sector can come in and buoy this, can be a really, really powerful thing. And I think the great thing, we are in an election year. We're in an election few weeks of holding our breath. And the reality is no matter what administration comes in, this is a priority. And so I think that, between all of this, whether the government pulls back or not, the reality is we're going to be pushing forward. Every one of these founders that I talk to, they have more vim and vigor behind them, more energy than I have seen in a very, very long time. And investing in space tech is very different than investing in B2B SaaS. But at the same time, speed is of the essence. And our moment and our opportunity to actually create change in a really meaningful way is now. And so I think, yes, it's a risk, but that's our business.
Jordan, what do you think about those political risks? I mean, I do think both on the civil and the defense side, they've opened up enormous opportunity for startups, but we're not necessarily seeing that translate into sort of a long-term success of a business, with the exception of, say, a SpaceX.
Yeah, I hope there's a new equivalent of like commercial cargo, commercial crew, is what I'd say is we all kind of ride those tailwinds from SpaceX having that success and what was that bet with commercial cargo and commercial crew. And I think less of the industry stands on Artemis. Like obviously it's a huge driver of Blue and SpaceX and their current programs, but if Artemis went away, there's huge commercial opportunity otherwise. And that's something that wasn't true 20 years ago. And I think that's a huge success that we all should celebrate, that we're not solely pivotal on the government anymore. That if the government stopped buying launch vehicles, that to Caitlin's point, it would be a hit on the industry. But I think the industry as a whole, the space industry, would be self-sufficient commercially. And but I do hope again that like as that wave happens of kind of commercial cargo, commercial crew, those programs are successful, of what is that next phase that is stemming a broader industry. Artemis is a huge foothold on the moon, but that's not necessarily long-term commercial, long-term industry presence on the moon. What does that look like as a post-Artemis implementation of a commercialization of the moon?
Yeah, I think Artemis maybe is not the best example, but something like Clips. There are many, space startups that are hoping to eventually hitch a ride on one of those landers, and they need one or more of those companies to succeed in order to, prospect on the moon for water or helium in the case of Interloon. So it seems like those programs are maybe they're funding 5 or 6, but there are many more startups that are hoping that need those companies to succeed, and so maybe that's the risk that I was talking about there for the larger industry.
And Clips is a great step in that direction.
Yeah. I hear this a lot about space tech, which is that investing in space is not really about technical risk, it's about market risk. Do you agree, Louis?
Yeah, it definitely has an element of it. I think most people's definition of deep tech implies that you're taking a lot more technical risk than market risk. The truth about space tech is it's sort of a combination of both. I don't think it's if you build it, people will come. I think investors need to use a little bit more imagination as to how the market will evolve. But there was a lot of technical risk associated with the launches that we were funding, the satellite constellations. Now a lot of that infrastructure is being built out. There are a lot of these less tech risky bets to be made, particularly in the application layer. So I'm looking a lot at downstream geospatial startups. You're not necessarily betting on their ability to develop novel AI algorithms. It's very much how do you leverage the data, and it becomes a lot more market-centric than it does tech-centric.
Caitlin, I was wondering what you thought about that. Earlier this morning, we had Evan Rogers on stage, who's the CEO of True Anomaly, and he was like, technical proficiency is table stakes. It's about how do you navigate government, how do you talk to customers. What do you think about that statement?
I agree, and I think it's just another demonstration that we really have graduated to this next chapter of where space needs to go. In that it is, remember the early days of music, right? Moving through the different variations of technology and how expensive the first CD player was, things like that, and the thing might explode in your house and it cost thousands of dollars and hundreds of pounds. And now we all have it in our pocket, right? And so I think this graduation of technology, and so when I say the industry has been building behind closed doors for so long, for decades, this interest, it didn't go away, it just went quietly to the back. And now it is becoming more consumer facing again, and for good reason, because it's about to blossom, it's about to bloom. And so technology is not necessarily the driver, it is expected. You think about mobility and the ease of getting to and fro. This is becoming more and more of a non-issue. So now we're thinking about, well, what are we going to do once we're there? And how is that going to be sustainable in our practices around that? And more importantly, what is the impact of all of these companies that are going to come to fruition at the same time? And so I think that we're going to see just this explosion of incredible new young companies who are thinking, not beyond the tip of the spear. This is a really, really exciting moment. And so, yeah, get it right and be safe. Yeah, table stakes. That's a non-negotiable. The teams that are going to be the ones that win are the ones that are going to outperform by shipping. We've had a bevy of companies that dream really big, beautiful, incredible ideas that are very awe-inspiring, but they cannot deliver. And so the companies that are going to be the ones that win are the ones that can ship, and ship very quickly and to spec. Safety and technology first. But it should not be the defining factor of if you're investing or not anymore.
We've talked a little bit about launch, but Jordan, I wanted to hear what else you're excited by. What are things that are maybe overlooked opportunities in the space industry?
Yeah, so where we look now is not only applications that are on that frontier of launch costs dropping, the frontier of areas that people even think about. Then one of our CEOs, Justin Fiaschetti, was on stage earlier, and where they're looking at targeted delivery and using space as a transportation layer for applications that some they think of today, some they get surprised by when a customer approaches them. And so there's things that are getting possible in space economically, technically, that people wouldn't have thought of as launch costs open up. Then those range from things like orbital delivery, manufacturing in space, manufacturing on the moon. Then what does that look like? And then what is the future of the moon in general? I think that timeline is starting to make sense for venture investing in a way that maybe 5-10 years ago was too early. Then you look at SpaceX 10 years ago, Falcon 9 was flying for the first time. And look at what's possible today. Fast forward 10 years, so kind of a standard venture fund horizon, what's going to be possible in 10 years with launchers continuing to develop, launch costs coming down. So it's the future of the moon, future of interplanetary transport, future of in-space activities, LEO, MEO, GEO, that don't make sense perhaps today, but as that ecosystem develops, it will make sense in 5-10 years.
In terms of those timelines and where SpaceX was 10 years ago and where SpaceX is today, will Starship change everything as much as the SpaceX lovers say it will, or is that a little overstated, Lewis?
So it's not going to be immediate. So the conversations we've had with SpaceX and the companies that have spoken to SpaceX on a regular basis, the expectation is it's not going to translate to the commercial sector for quite a while. And I've heard estimates up to 2031 before they'll open up commercial services, quite like they do a transporter mission on a Falcon 9. But it will take a long, long time. And unsure whether the economics will necessarily translate as well. So people always talk about this $300 per kilo.
Yeah.
I mean, how much of that is, if they've not got any competition, how much would they offload to the customer or not?
Right.
So sort of a lot of big questions to ask, but in terms of capability, in terms of launching vast volumes, and I think everyone should almost have a Starship strategy or a post-Starship strategy to an extent. We're invested in a lot of satellite constellations, and if you're telling me with Starship you can put up a whole constellation in one launch, then that changes the dynamics to an extent. Also in terms of the size of platform. So if some of those economics are translated to the customer, what are you capable of doing in a much larger platform? Does spatial resolution and cost really come into play, quite like you operate your constellation on Falcon 9? Lots of fundamental questions. I think people should be thinking about it, whether there's going to be an impact. I don't think it's going to be as soon as a lot of the Starship and SpaceX lovers think.
So up until 2031, I think is what you said. They would just be launching Starlink and things like that. Is that what you're saying? And then they would
lunar
open up
missions. I think they're more fixated on government is sort of the what I've been told.
So just time for one more, and I did want to hear from you, Caitlin. What are you really excited about in the industry, and what to you is an overlooked opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, there is so much, and again, I am a baby in this space, and so I'm learning every single day what these gentlemen have known for a very long time. And so the things that get me really excited are companies that are actually creating their own economies and their own markets. And so the in-space economy is absolutely fascinating. And then, of course, any of those companies that are building at that cross-section of climate tech and space tech, I think, are deeply fascinating. I believe that we can live on Earth and sustain in a really beautiful way and expand the bounds of where we go and what we do off-planet. So I'm excited about everything.
Great. Well, I look forward to catching up with you guys in 5 years, and we'll see how much blood has been spilled or not.
Absolutely.
Thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having me.